Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we will be discussing citizenship in the Muslim world. And joining us is the Muslim scholar Sheikh Dr. Usama Attar, a renowned scholar all the way from Canada. Let's start our discussion today with what really is citizenship. You've been discussing this a lot in your lectures. So maybe if you just start by telling us what is citizenship in context of Islam.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin. Citizenship can be briefly divided into an individual, and the family, as well as the society. So individually, being a good citizen is establishing the connection between yourself and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, doing your salat, having your fast, improving yourself from within. And then that would be reflected on your interactions with the family, which then in turn is reflected on the interactions with the society. So good citizenship in Islam is taking care of oneself, one's family, and taking care of the entire society at large. Examples are from Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, as Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi praying in the middle of the night, 1,000 rak'ahs as we are told, for example, and some days that he used to pray. That's between him and Allah. And then he would go out with his family and he would admonish his own children, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein, and Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah, as we have some letters written by Imam Ali towards Imam al-Hassan salamullahi alayhi. And then going to the whole society, especially when he became the Khalifa, when he saw that Christian man, for example, begging on the street, and he said, "What is this?" And the companion said, "He's a Christian man." He replied, "No, I didn't say, 'Who is this?' I said, 'What is this?'" And then he turned to his Minister of Treasury, or what we may call today the Minister of Treasury, and told him that find him a house that is appropriate for himself and his family and assign him a monthly salary. So this is citizenship, where one shows care about each and every member of the society, irrespective of their background, and that's based on humanitarian ties.
If we have all these traditions of citizenship in Islam, as you have just described, why then are Muslims labeled as terrorists and seen to be creating all this havoc with terrorism around the world?
This is a more complex answer. It has several facets to be discussed. The first facet is Muslims' deviation and neglect of the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Quran states on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying, وَقَالَ الرَّسُولُ, and the messenger said, "Oh my Lord, my community has neglected the Quran." They have deserted the Quran. So when they deserted the Quran and they started basically following and applying their own understanding of their religion as opposed to holding on to the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, when the allegiance of Ghadir was pushed aside and the others came to power, and that led basically to the rise of the Umayyad dynasty, followed by the Abbasi dynasty, followed by the Ottoman empires, and so on and so forth. So we see what happened there is a continuous deviation. Initially when you have a straight line, a tangent line initially would not have much of a distance, but after 1400 years that gap is quite wide. And we're seeing that effect in this day and age. So the Muslims neglect from the hadith of the Prophet, which is narrated in Sahih Muslim, "I'm leaving amongst you the Holy Quran and my progeny, my family." When they let go of the essence of the Quran, the spirit of the Quran, and the family, that led basically to the state they are in right now. And this was actually indicated by the sermon of Fatima Zahra alayha salam in Fadak, where she actually told the Muslims explicitly, if you don't correct your act right now and fix the mistake, then it will have some dire consequences. And we are seeing this exactly. So that's one. The second is the imperial powers, when they came and they started to invade the Muslim countries or the Middle East and the other Arab countries, they came with an agenda. And the agenda is basically to divide and conquer. So you find them, for example, dividing a tribe into two countries and not allowing these tribes to visit one another when they're like one family. So all of a sudden they've introduced some barriers. And then using some influence and power to give rise to the minority to become the power and the majority to be deprived of power. We see, for example, in countries like Bahrain, where you have 85% of the population as Shia Muslims, yet the ruling dynasty is a Sunni, and it is actively oppressing, unfortunately, the Shias, as we are seeing even until this day and age. And this has been going on for decades, if you know, this kind of treatment. And similar issues are happening in other places. So that imperial influence in dividing and conquering and in empowering the minorities has resulted in some of the problems we're seeing here. A third facet is poverty and social injustice. You know, today we find a lot of countries where this kind of terrorism is being harbored and produced. Most of them are poor countries, you know, where people are living way below the poverty line. And with poverty comes ignorance. When you have a hungry stomach, then you can't educate people. And human nature, people will do anything if you give them a loaf of bread, you know. And hence, when they're given a loaf of bread on one hand and a gun on the other hand, they will just do whatever it is to keep that loaf of bread. And when there is a hungry stomach, then you cannot educate, you cannot teach. So a lot of those people don't have much education at all. And again, so it results in them being persuaded and brainwashed by individuals who have some political agenda that they would like to push further. So these three components are among the issues and the problems we're seeing in the world today. So we have the Muslims deviating from the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, the Quran, the essence of the Quran, and the family of the Prophet ﷺ. The second is we have the imperial powers that came. And third, we have the poverty, which is prevalent in a lot of these Muslim countries.
So are you then accepting that Muslims actually are terrorists? Because from what you are explaining, it seems like we are blaming the Western media for branding us as terrorists, but then you're saying that Muslims actually are practicing terrorism.
No, that is not justifiable. You know, the answer I gave explains why that certain terrorist group is coming up and developing. You know, and the Muslim world contains 2 billion people. The terrorist fraction of them is very minor, you know, but usually they make the spotlights. Take, for example, the United States of America. They have the highest ratio per capita of prisoners, you know, in all of the world. Okay. And if we take a look at that, can one say then, you know, this entire country is messed up? It's nonsense, of course. You know, they have a lot of good policies. I mean, they have some democracies, education, and so on and so forth. So one cannot say that, you know, all the Americans are bad just because you have about 2 or so millions, or give or take, who are in prisons, and they have the highest ratio of prisoners in the world. You have a fraction in every society, every community, every country in the world, every nation. You have the good and the bad. Okay. In Islam, out of 2 billion people, when you have the minority that is bad, these are the ones that are making the news. Okay. Now, this minority is being empowered, is being given some weapons, is being given some military training to cause havoc, and hence they're the ones making the news all the time. So we do not say that all Muslims are terrorists. No, this is wrong. But those who are terrorists have become so as a consequence of the neglect of the teachings of the Prophet, the imperial powers, and the poverty and the social injustice that we observe.
Fair enough. You know, you've been talking about the small group of Muslims who have deviated and therefore, you know, are terrorists. But then again, you know, if we look at the examples in history and look at the leadership such as that of the Holy Prophet, when we are talking to non-Muslims, we are unable to explain that we have such great historical examples, because in today's world, we really don't see this kind of leadership within the Muslims. So why is that?
We can respond to that argument in that those who held on to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad and followed the path of his divine family do have leadership. in 2003 or 2004, when the American army entered into Iraq, there was a time when there was a clash between the American army and some factions in the holy city of Najaf. At that time, Ayatollah Sistani, may Allah prolong his life, was out of the country for some medical treatment. When he came back, I remember listening to an American radio station in Los Angeles, California, that morning, where they said Sistani did in 24 hours what the Americans could not achieve for the past 2 months. So literally within 24 hours upon his arrival, the entire war faded down. The Americans withdrew their forces from Najaf, and everything was calmed down. We saw another example of such leadership when the holy shrines were bombed down in northern Iraq, the holy shrines of Imam al-Askari and Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam. There was an immediate backlash by some of the Shia against some of the Sunnis, but several Shia scholars issued an immediate ruling saying that it is forbidden for any Shia to attack any Sunni individual or infrastructure. And that basically stopped an entire civil war. Such continuous actions made actually some people nominate or wanting to nominate Ayatollah Sistani for a Nobel Prize for Peace. And such leadership does exist. So those who do adhere to the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam indeed have some leadership, and there has been several examples throughout the history. Ayatollah Sayyid Shirazi in Iran back in 1891 issued a fatwa forbidding the use and the interaction with tobacco, because there was an imperial power that was trying to basically drain the energies and the money out of Iran at the time. And an agreement was signed already, but that whole plot just failed because of one ruling by this Marja, this Ayatollah. And then we have a Sheikh Shirazi in Iraq in 1920, who upon the British occupation of Iraq, he issued a fatwa for basically defending the country. And that basically showed everyone the greatness of the Marja'iyya. So throughout, history, there are several examples of leadership among those who follow the path of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, because of that connection to the Imam, which is the divine successor to the Prophet Muhammad. In that other school of thought, such leadership, sometimes it does exist, and sometimes it is not there. And hence, you may not have that kind of attachment to such guidance, and therefore, you may not have that kind of attitude and reaction observed.
Picking up from the same discussion about leadership, we have even seen good leadership not in that long ago. So for example, during the pro-Palestinian movement at the time of Yasser Arafat, we saw leadership. We saw a lot of countries around the world who supported very strongly Yasser Arafat and spoke out for the rights of the Palestinians. But today, if we look at the situation today, this is really not there. So you see a lot of Muslim countries and leaders in particular completely silent on this. What do you think about this?
As we described earlier, the imperial powers, when they came, they made sure to choose the leadership carefully. And in most of the countries today, the leadership has been chosen or supported by former or current imperial powers. Now, some of those leaders, early on, like in 1973, there was actually a threat to boycott the oil and from basically sending it to the Western countries. And this created havoc in several countries in the world. As a consequence, the West became more protective of its interests and choosing who to lead certain nations. And this has basically given the consequence that we observe today, where sadly, not a single Muslim leader, or very, very few, would basically speak even to condemn the atrocities happening in the Muslim world with several countries.
You know, we are told in Islam that leadership, if there's a bad leadership, it's a reflection of the society. And therefore, if people do not put in good leaders, then it is also people's fault. And we see that today. We see that people are quiet, they are not protesting, they are not rising up, they are not questioning, they're not complaining about these bad leaders. So, how do we explain this?
Now, in some cases, they do speak. You have journalists who are right, and you have people, but they are just voices that are silenced, or voices that have no power. In many cases, you have individuals marching in the streets, discussing, talking, but no one listens to them. In Nigeria, for example, just recently there was a demonstration against the attacks taking place in Palestine, and the government actually shot these demonstrators, and people were killed. So, which kind of makes one surprised. A peaceful rally, why would the government introduce violence in stopping it? So people don't have any power, and unfortunately, that's one reason where they're not being heard. Okay, that's one. Two, in a lot of these countries, the people are kept preoccupied with other problems, poverty, lack of security. So people now, they have, let's say, other priorities. Just survive, and go get your earnings. And that, unfortunately, has made some individuals not realize the great society and citizenship in the world, but rather keeping us preoccupied with our own problems. So these are a couple of the reasons, among several others as well.
How do you think we can overcome this?
A strategy needs to be implemented nationally and internationally. And by what I mean nationally is in the countries themselves, and internationally by the whole global community. First and foremost, trillions of dollars are being spent today on war to achieve peace, which sounds quite ironic. And we have not seen any fruitful results yet. Taking a look, for example, at Pakistan, taking a look at Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Palestine. Maybe it's time that the world would actually change its tactic. And instead of investing, or wasting, I should say, billions or trillions of dollars on war, if these trillions of dollars can be spread on social justice programs, food, establishing schools, hospitals, then you will find a lot of those terrorists, would actually be decreased, because there's no motivation anymore to fight. Okay, so that's one. Two, people need to not be fooled by slogans. They need to take charge. We saw what the Arab Spring did, so it does definitely have power. However, we also saw that some governments that came as a consequence of the Arab Springs were not ones that had the capacity to lead and to rule. And hence you find instabilities in some of those countries. So people need to take charge, but in a wise manner, to make sure that the leadership that is chosen is actually a true and sincere leadership. Okay. Three, change does not happen unless we begin from within. As a community, as a society, in the Muslim world, we have imposed visa, travel restrictions on the Muslim world. Some of these need to be lifted. Let the Muslim world travel freely. Let them become, like brothers. Like, for example, look at the European Union? Why can't we have like a Middle Eastern Union, or let's say an Arab Union, for example? In order for this to happen, you need a big push. Okay, so it's very complex. It's very complex. That push, that change to happen. You're not talking about one country, two countries. You're talking about a dozen or even more countries where leadership is very corrupt. And you find the leaders with billions of dollars, and the people are dying and starving. And unless this leadership can change, and this is not going to change unless the people get some power, but that power should also be driven by a proper leadership, which is also lacking. So it's kind of, we're going in circles here. But it is doable. It is doable. It is something that can happen. Let's take a look, for example, at Japan. After World War II, they were basically destroyed. Okay, but look at them today. Germany is an example. So people need to put down their interests and have this vision and the leadership that can really drive a change, and this would help.
We spoke about bad leaders, and we also spoke about disempowered people. So do you think that, seeing the way the Muslims in the West are picking up these issues now, that possibly this is where the leadership will come from? For example, if you look at the protest for Palestinians, pro-Palestinian movement, pro-Palestinian protest in London, there have been over 170,000 people marching on the street demanding rights for the Palestinians. So do you think that the push for Muslim countries or for justice will actually come from this part of the world?
Muslims who grew up in the West, they may have had the ability to at least get the education, the proper tools maybe that could drive a change. Okay. Having said this, however, they don't yet understand the complete picture compared to one who is living in that country, grown up in that country, knows the difficulties of that country. And hence, we saw an example in Iraq where people who came from outside to lead, they did not really have a good understanding of what's going on. Okay, and hence there's unfortunately failure in that state, and the current state of affairs is an attest to all that failure. So there has to be a collaboration. There has to be work from both ends. Those who are in that country and those who may come from the West, they need to work together, because just to come with the attitude that I've come from the West and I've come from these big schools and I have the education and so on and so forth, that does not give you the experience. And you need both to become successful.
But Muslims as a group, as a force in these Western countries, don't you think that they are actually the ones who can change these policies? Because they are part and parcel of these countries. So can they not make change to policies?
There are even many non-Muslims who do not support such policies. Okay. I think that Muslims are not doing a great job in spreading the message, in discussing the affairs, in talking about the problems. Muslims seem to be preoccupied with their own affairs. Like, I'm okay, I'm doing well, so I don't need to worry about the others. And that kind of attitude needs to change. Well, those people who immigrated, the Muslims who immigrated, they came from countries where maybe a lot of them did not have democracies. So a lot of them, even the concept of voting is actually some foreign concept. Or if you vote, you would be kind of biased towards one particular party. Okay, not realizing that this is actually a privilege that must be practiced. Okay, so something simple as that is sometimes not being perceived by those immigrants, first generation. The second generation are being sucked into this kind of environment which is work, and play, like we see in some parts of the world. Okay, So they're just completely out of touch. Okay, and you have then the other group, which some of them, you know what, don't have that care, don't have that passion. Okay, so indeed, Muslims do need to rise and make it as a cause to at least educate, because the rally that was witnessed in the UK a few weeks ago about what's happening in Palestine, where 100,000 people marched in London, majority of them are not Muslims. It demonstrates that despite the media propaganda, people are actually learning of the truth and understanding what it is. Now imagine if we can capitalize on this. These 100,000, some of them even are politicians, MPs, and so a lot can happen, a lot can occur. It's just we as Muslims also in the West need leadership. We are lacking the leadership with such vision, and a leadership that has no interest whatsoever other than just to drive a change. You know, we need the Gandhi. We need, and hence there was an article many years ago, I remembered, it's like, when is the Gandhi of Islam gonna rise? And now I would say that no, not the Gandhi, we actually need the Imam Hussein alayhi salam. We have the Ahlul Bayt, which are, Gandhi learned from them. We need that attitude of that Muslims, that these leadership. And we're lacking that, unfortunately. We're lacking such visions, and we're lacking such leadership.
Viewers who are watching you and listening to you at this very moment, how do you convince them, for example, that a lot of them sit behind and look at Islam as being a non-political religion, and for them worship usually means going to the mosque, staying up at night and praying, but they don't look at things like protesting, speaking out as part and parcel of worship, of religion. How do you make them realize that there is more to Islam than just being on the prayer mat?
It starts with education. Education in the house, education from the pulpit, education in the schools, to make people realize one hadith of the Prophet, one tradition where he says, anyone who wakes up in the morning and goes to sleep at night and has not paid any care to the affairs of the Muslims, then he's not one of them. Okay? And the example I give is, if your mother is in dire need of help, would you feel comfortable and just completely don't care? If she's, God forbid, in the hospital, between life and death, how would you feel? Now, that is basically the relationship we have, the bond of brotherhood and sisterhood among all Muslims. So I have to really care about each and every Muslim to the best of my ability. In fact, I would take it a step further. I would have to care about every human being, because the hadith of Imam Ali alayhi salam in his letter to Malik al-Ashtar, his governor in Egypt, he told him that be aware that people in this world fall under one of two categories. They're either your brother and sister in faith or your counterpart in humanity. So we have to care about the whole humanity, and hence, as human beings, if we don't, then I don't know if we can really actually call ourselves human beings anymore. So it is important for Muslims to realize that today's political leaders are the ones who are making decisions. We need to get involved in this political process, okay, to make a difference and to drive change. Otherwise, nothing will happen.
One of the other problems that we're facing right now, and really is like cancer, is the division between the Sunni and the Shia people. This is really sad, considering that, Muslims of all kinds, Shia and Sunni in particular, have coexisted, have intermarried each other. Why is it so easy today to turn them against each other as a community, even in this part of the world? Why are we so easily turned against each other?
I would not call it a Sunni-Shia conflict. I would call it a Wahhabi versus everyone else conflict. Okay. Wahhabism, created by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who died in the late 1700s, so we're talking about over 250 years ago approximately. It came with an agenda, a propaganda, to destroy Islam from within. And we're seeing its effects right now. Okay, so it took centuries for that movement, but they were quite dedicated and they had a plan. And now we're seeing the results of such plans. That agenda is basically to destroy Islam and to destroy anyone who comes in the path of their agenda. A good example is last year in Syria, that movement went into a Sunni mosque where there was a sheikh by the name of Dr. Muhammad al-Bouti. And he's a Sunni sheikh, but he does not support any of such terrorism and killing and bloodshed and destruction. So he was speaking as a human being that these actions are wrong and one should not support them. Just because he said that, even though he's a Sunni, they went inside his mosque, the place where he preaches, and he was just teaching some other students. They shot him, they bombed the place, they killed the students, and they left. That tells us it's not a Shia-Sunni conflict. We're having a Wahhabi versus everyone else conflict. Okay? Al-Azhar University, until this day and age, considers the Shia madhab as part of the other madhahib. The 5 madhahib. So it's 4 Sunni and 1 Shia, the madhab al-Ja'fari. The same group that did this in Syria, when they went now to Iraq and Mosul, they did the same thing to some of the Sunni sheikhs there as well. Okay, so and on the other hand, Shias in Iraq today have accepted Sunni refugees, the holy shrine of Imam Hussein, Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, and Imam Ali alayhi salam. They have accepted Sunni and Christian refugees now who are actually seeking refuge, and they're being fully taken care of in terms of their accommodation, food, security, and so on and so forth. It tells us that it's not only Shia Sunni, it's actually a humanitarian cause. So they are helping each other as human beings. Okay? But the Wahhabi agenda and those behind it driving it, they want to propagate the message that it is a Shia-Sunni conflict. Until this day and age, you have Shia and Sunni marrying each other, working with each other, praying behind one another, supporting one another. We do have differences, but we need to learn to respect that we have differences. And we need to learn to work with one another, despite our differences.
Who is ISIS?
ISIS, simply speaking, is a terrorist group with an agenda to destroy Islam from within, under the name of Islam. Okay, they carry this Wahhabi ideologies. If you're not with us, you're against us. They interpret the Quran in a deviating manner to accomplish their tasks. And as I mentioned, they do not discriminate between Shias or Sunnis. It's anyone who comes their path, they will destroy him, or the mosque and the infrastructure. So they've destroyed Sunni infrastructure, they've killed Sunni sheikhs as well as Shia infrastructure and Shia scholars, and they continue to push for their agenda, which is basically to destroy Islam and Muslims from within.
There's a lot of discussion about Palestine at the moment, and also about Iraq and what is taking place. Do you have any updates that what is going on there that probably you can share with our viewers?
Unfortunately, the government of Iraq is very weak. People who are there, they are looking after their own interests as opposed to the interest of the people that elected them. And because of this, no investment was made on the military and to have some commanders who can actually lead the military. As a consequence, and because of people looking after their own interests, stealing the public's money and just looking after their own enrichment, foreign terrorist powers such as ISIS, they seized that opportunity and they attacked Iraq, which was very vulnerable and unfortunately could not defend itself. So the situation is very sad there, where there is a lot of destruction, killing, and a lot of people who have been moved from their homes and displaced. So over 500,000 people have been displaced so far. Okay, and ISIS has a plan to basically control all of Iraq. And there is another plan to basically divide Iraq into three states, three countries. Like we saw with the Soviet Union, for example, breaking up. The Kurd, the Sunni, and the Shia in the south. Okay, and apparently this is a plot that is being backed by some other countries. You have some monarchies who are not very pleased with what's going on in Iraq and the democracy and the election, because they say they see it as a threat to their own state. They say, what if people do the same to us? So to them, that kind of elections, voting, should not be supported at all. And hence, with all this backing and the billions and trillions of dollars given to these terrorist groups to actually destroy Iraq, unfortunately, they seem to be winning. But with the guidance of the scholars of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, the Maraja, the Mujtahids, the Ayatollahs in Iraq, hopefully, inshallah, their plan will fail and they will succeed in gaining Iraq back, inshallah, and security back.
There's some feelings from some quarters of the Shia populations around the world that after what has happened in Gaza, situations and issues that are happening, for example, in Syria and Iraq and Bahrain, have taken a back seat. And you think that there's any justification to that? Is there any truth to this?
Unfortunately, I wouldn't say that only the place of Iraq and Syria are forgotten about, but rather many other places. Few days ago, there was a well-respected lawyer in Pakistan who's a son-in-law of a scholar there who was shot and killed. And you didn't hear much of the news about it. People are facing an ethnic cleansing in Pakistan, and no one is saying a word. We're seeing the atrocities in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia. There's Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, for example, who in Saudi Arabia was taken behind bars 2 years ago. And we don't even hear about him anymore. He's not in the news, he's not even mentioned. Shias attacked in Malaysia. The convention that was held in Indonesia, the Anti-Shia Alliance, convention. So instead of having the anti, for example, other influences, they're considering Shia as the biggest threat. That is not making the news anymore. You don't even hear about any of this stuff anymore. So from a humanitarian perspective, every human life is very precious, and I want to emphasize, even what we're seeing happening in some other countries in the world, non-Muslim countries, like Ukraine, for example, the innocents being killed there, and anywhere, we value every human life as a precious life. So, but again, not much is being discussed all about this, but rather there seems to be some focus on some regions in the world, and there seems to be kind of this implication that there's a drive to make people forget about what's going on everywhere and just focus on this for now, so that the agenda could be carried out properly elsewhere in the world. So unfortunately, that there is some sort of that happening over a continuous period of time.
If you look at it from another perspective, would you say that the reactions we're getting for Gaza is actually a positive thing? Because for the first time, all Muslims really have united and are coming together, and we are not talking about divisions of sects here when we are supporting Gaza. So we're all talking with one voice as Muslims. Isn't that a positive thing?
Tragedy that is occurring in Gaza these days, according to one Canadian newspaper, they say actually the Palestinians are winning the war, because now there's a public international outcry about what's going on. I mean, most of the casualties from the Israeli side are soldiers, whereas the majority of the casualties on the Palestinian side are civilians. So it is definitely a tragedy, and one should not, be silenced about it. It's good that the world is talking about it. It's good that it's brought people together, but we don't need a tragedy to unite us. Whenever we see a problem anywhere in the world, we should always be united to speak against that kind of oppression, whether it's done to Muslims or non-Muslims. injustice is injustice. And from the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, they taught us to respect the value of a human being. So that action must be done, and it should not be done at the cost of one group versus another. Not to say that this group is not important, but we should shed light on the whole concept of oppression altogether.
But still, don't you think, that us coming together as a Muslim Ummah in support of Palestine during this Gaza war that has happened, that this actually has been a very positive thing, because it is killing the ideology of the divide and rule that has been set to separate Muslims into different corners. So it's actually a very positive thing at the moment. Would you not agree to that?
Well, first of all, I have not seen many Muslim leaders, in fact, even condemn what's going on in Palestine, and that's a shame. It's a big shame for us. Okay, not many papers are writing about that either, and that's also another shame. Okay, so that's one thing, one problem there. Another problem is we cannot say that, let's concentrate on Palestine because it's a uniting factor, uniting force. Why isn't Iraq a uniting force? Why is there that bias that exists among them? We need to educate the Muslim world. A human life is very important, whether it is, a Shia or a Sunni, or a human being, a Christian, or a Jew even. If there is oppression that is being committed against any group, we stand against it. We do not support it at all. Okay, but to say that, let's concentrate on Palestine because it unites us, I would, say that, okay, Palestine is a very important issue, definitely, but I would not just put all my concentration on Palestine, but rather try to bring the awareness that there are a lot of atrocities happening all over the world, and we need to pay attention to all of this, and not just focus on one particular issue, but rather, like I said, go to the deeper concept, which is the injustice and the oppression. And then you can unite all these issues together in that one factor.
As a Shia scholar, this problem is not just within Muslims, but within the Shia community itself as well, as there are huge divisions between the Shia community itself in terms of who we follow, different marajas, different communities coming from different parts of the world. We discriminate against each other. How can we ever expect to stand up as a force when there are such deep-seated divisions within us?
We need basically to go back to our maraja. If we take a look at them, they themselves have solidarity amongst each other. They respect one another. They talk to one another. They communicate with each other. And we need to learn from their akhlaq and their manners. So that's one thing we have to learn from our fuqaha and mujtahids. And it's an educational process that must be done at the community level, at different organizations and groups to promote such leadership. And slowly, these days, we're actually seeing a lot of collaboration from various groups on different issues. And that's, I think, is a positive thing. It needs to be pushed further. And given some time, I think more and more such unity would be observed.
For a lot of Muslims who are watching this and are feeling very disturbed with what is happening in the Muslim world, in Syria, in Iraq, in Bahrain, in Palestine, and many other countries, but at the same time they feel like there is very little they can do. They're feeling this frustration because they cannot make a difference. What would you recommend? What do you think they should be doing?
Several things. One, first and foremost, do not underestimate the power of dua. So at least pray. Keep them every single day. Pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to support the Muslims, to enable them to achieve victory, to have peace and security. And inshallah, dua is accepted. So we may not see the dua, immediately being accepted right now, but it's definitely having an effect. So that's one thing. So dua is very important. That's the first step. Second, organizing rallies. Organizing demonstrations is very important. The rally we saw, earlier in the UK with 100,000 people going out. This sends a very strong message to some even businesses that, oh, there's a lot of interest here about this particular issue. So maybe we should also consider our business, affiliations. Okay, so such rallies do play a role. Okay, that's 2. 3, approaching the media. We do not have, unfortunately, a lot of Muslims writing in newspapers, going on television, doing some interviews. That we need a lot more. I remember talking to an editor-in-chief of one of the newspapers in Canada, and she said if we receive 10 editorials about a particular topic, we are obliged to at least publish one. Because if we receive 10, it means there's about at least another 100 or 1,000 people out there who share the same concern. So we need to flood these newspapers with editorials, with write-ups. And we haven't been doing that very well. So that's writing up. Those who have the good skills to write up, they need to. 4th, those who are at the universities. A university is an arena where people are educated. So you can actually conduct seminars. Those who are at the universities should and must start conducting seminars where they could enlighten people about what's going on. And these individuals will, one day grow up to become, CEOs and so on and so forth. So it will have a big impact. And from that university, every university has also a newspaper, the university newspapers. And it is being read by the people who attend that university, so 5,000, 10,000 people read these newspapers at each university. People should write in these newspapers as well, so that at least these 5,000 or so people can have access to that. That's 4. 5, an educational seminar needs to be conducted at the grassroots. So going to schools, attending schools and telling the teachers of these schools, the principal, that we have a particular event that we would like to sponsor. Okay, and some of these principals would be happy to actually accept such sponsorship. And if we can do so, then we are working with the younger generation who will one day grow up to accept and realize what the truth is. Okay, so these 5 things must be done, and more activism should be showed.
You talked about the power of dua, and you particularly are very well known for your recitations, especially that there is a certain depth to your voice that people really connect to. What is your secret?
Inshallah, I have that kind of connection, but I always pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make my recitation come from the heart. So, alhamdulillah, inshallah, I guess some people may think that it is coming from the heart, so inshallah it continues to be that way.
Sheikh Usama Attar, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.